She smirked as she entered the courtroom at the 5th District Court in St. George, Utah. She believed her calm appearance would convince people that she was innocent. The well-known YouTube personality argued that she had been psychologically manipulated and influenced by her business partner, Jodi Hildebrandt. Defense attorneys claimed that Hildebrandt, a licensed mental health counselor, had used her professional authority to influence Franke, isolate her from her family, and create what they described as a distorted moral framework, convincing her that physical punishment was necessary to remove evil influences and teach the children repentance. At first, the defense argument appeared reasonable. The jury considered it carefully, but then prosecutors presented multiple layers of evidence, and everything changed. What you are about to see is the moment the mother of 6 realized that the distorted moral framework she used to raise her children had pushed her far beyond the boundaries of discipline and parental guidance. And every detail you are about to hear has been verified through court records, law enforcement reports, surveillance footage, and testimony presented during legal proceedings. This became one of the most disturbing and controversial child abuse cases in the United States in recent years, centered around the radicalization of parenting beliefs within the life of a famous family YouTuber. If you have never heard this story before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Ivins, Utah, on the 30th of August 2023 will challenge everything you think you know about parenting, discipline, and how far a person can go once they begin justifying their own harmful actions. To understand why Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt were sitting inside that courtroom and how they were ultimately sentenced, you first need to understand the full story behind the case and the lives these individuals were living before everything collapsed. Before her arrest, Ruby Franke was widely known in Utah as a mother of 6 and the face of a family YouTube channel called 8 Passengers. She created the channel with her husband, Kevin Franke, and for years their videos presented a carefully organized picture of family life. Viewers saw daily routines, parenting lessons, marriage discussions, school mornings, chores, and moments meant to show discipline inside a large American household. At first, Ruby's public image was built around structure. She appeared direct, confident, and deeply committed to raising responsible children. To many followers, she seemed like a strict but intentional parent. The channel grew to millions of subscribers, making Ruby one of the most recognizable family vloggers in the United States. But over time, some viewers began to question what they were watching. Certain videos showed parenting choices that felt unusually harsh. Ruby spoke about taking away a child's bedroom for months, refusing to bring lunch to a child who had forgotten it, threatening to damage a child's toy as punishment, and withholding Christmas gifts from 2 younger children because she said they had been selfish. For some viewers, these were not just strict parenting moments. They looked like signs of control, emotional pressure, and a home where discipline had crossed a troubling line. Another important figure entered Ruby's life during this period. Jodi Hildebrandt, a licensed counselor and founder of Connections, promoted a program centered on truth, accountability, and correcting what she called distorted thinking. Ruby became increasingly close to Jodi, worked with her publicly, and began adopting more of her language and beliefs. That relationship would later become one of the most important pieces in understanding how Ruby's public image began to separate from what was happening behind closed doors. It was the first fracture in the story. By early 2023, the public image surrounding the Franke family had already started to shift. The 8 Passengers channel became less active, while Ruby devoted more time to Connections and her work with Jodi Hildebrandt. Her language also changed. Conversations about parenting became centered on obedience, accountability, and correcting what she described as distorted behavior in children. Inside the family, relationships appeared increasingly strained. Ruby and Kevin Franke spent periods living separately, and their oldest daughter, Shari, later said relatives had tried for years to raise concerns about the children's welfare. According to reports, calls had been made to both law enforcement and child protection agencies before the case became public. On the 18th of September, 2022, Shari contacted authorities after believing some of her younger siblings had been left alone for an extended period. Officers conducted welfare checks in the following days, but investigators were not able to fully assess the children's condition at that time. Those earlier concerns would later take on far greater significance for everyone involved in Utah. Psychologically, the Ruby Franke case was not viewed by investigators as a single moment of anger or loss of control. Instead, it appeared to develop over time through an increasingly extreme approach to parenting and discipline. Long before the case became public, Ruby had already shown a pattern of using restriction, punishment, and emotional pressure as tools inside the home. After becoming closely connected with Jodi Hildebrandt and the Connections program, those beliefs appeared to deepen. Children were no longer described simply as misbehaving. In that environment, they were often framed as dishonest, distorted, or in need of correction. According to investigators and court records, one of the most concerning aspects of the case was that Ruby did not seem to view herself as causing harm. Authorities believe she may have convinced herself that isolation, food restriction, physical discomfort, and strict control were necessary forms of discipline. In that mindset, suffering became reframed as a lesson rather than a warning sign. Jodi Hildebrandt reportedly reinforced those ideas. Prosecutors later argued that both women participated in controlling and isolating Ruby's 12-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter inside Jodi's home in Ivins, Utah, for an extended period of time. On the 30th of August 2023, the investigation began after Ruby Franke's 12-year-old son escaped from Jodi Hildebrandt's home in Ivins, Utah. According to investigators, the boy climbed out through a window and ran to a nearby neighbor for help. When he arrived, he asked for food and water. The neighbor immediately noticed signs of severe physical distress. The child appeared extremely thin, exhausted, and had visible marks around his wrists and ankles that suggested he had been restrained for a prolonged period. The neighbor called 911.
We know there's been problems at this neighbor's house. He's emaciated, he's got tape around his legs, he's hungry, and he's thirsty. And he asked us to call the police. So he's very afraid.
Investigators later viewed that detail as evidence of significant emotional conditioning. His escape not only protected him, but also brought the larger situation inside the home to public attention for the first time publicly. After the 911 call on the 30th of August 2023, officers responded to Jodi Hildebrandt's home in Ivins, Utah. Inside the residence, investigators located Ruby Franke's 10-year-old daughter. According to reports, the child appeared severely malnourished, emotionally distressed, and isolated within the home. Both children were transported to a hospital for medical evaluation and treatment shortly afterward. Investigators documented visible injuries, signs of prolonged neglect, and marks consistent with restraints. Authorities later stated that the condition of the children did not appear connected to a temporary crisis or isolated incident. Instead, the evidence suggested a pattern of sustained control and physical hardship over time. The home itself became a critical part of the investigation. Officers collected physical evidence related to confinement and restriction, including materials investigators believed had been used to limit the children's movement. Some reports also referenced secured areas inside the residence that drew additional attention from investigators. Beyond the physical evidence, prosecutors later reviewed written records, witness statements, and investigative documents. Court filings indicated Ruby had documented disciplinary actions involving the children, which investigators viewed as evidence of awareness and direct involvement throughout the situation. The investigation quickly developed around three central areas. The first focused on the condition of the two children. Medical personnel and investigators documented signs of severe malnourishment, physical injury, and prolonged deprivation. Authorities stated that the marks on the children's bodies were consistent with restraints and extended physical hardship over a significant period of time. The second focus centered on Ruby Franke herself. Investigators did not view her as a distant or uninvolved parent. She was the children's mother and had a legal responsibility to care for and protect them. Instead, prosecutors later argued that she participated directly in the system of restriction and punishment taking place inside the home. As part of her plea agreement, Ruby later admitted to multiple acts of serious child abuse involving her children. The third area involved Jodi Hildebrandt. As the owner of the home and the leader of Connections, investigators believed she held significant psychological influence over Ruby. According to prosecutors, evidence showed that Jodi was aware of the children's condition and actively involved in the treatment they endured. Investigators also reviewed older YouTube videos to better understand the broader disciplinary environment surrounding the family over several years. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, authorities identified two central figures in the case. The primary suspect was Ruby Franke, the children's mother. prosecutors stated that she was not only aware of the conditions inside the home, but directly involved in maintaining the disciplinary system that affected the children over an extended period of time. The second individual was Jodi Hildebrandt, a counselor and founder of the Connections program. She owned the Ivins, Utah residence where the children were discovered on the 30th of August, 2023. Investigators believe Jodi played a significant role in shaping the environment inside the home and reinforcing the beliefs that guided the treatment of the children. According to court records, both women were accused of participating in the isolation, restriction, and prolonged mistreatment of Ruby's 12-year-old son and 10-year-old daughter. What made the case especially disturbing to many observers was that the children were not harmed by strangers. The people accused were individuals the children should have been able to trust completely and safely. After investigators located Ruby Franke's 10-year-old daughter inside the Ivins home on the 30th of August, 2023, both Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt were taken into custody later that same day. Prosecutors initially filed multiple felony child abuse charges against the two women. Because Ruby had spent years in the public eye as a family content creator, news of the arrests spread quickly across national media outlets. As the case moved through the court system, Ruby eventually agreed to a plea deal and admitted responsibility for her decision ended the possibility of a lengthy public trial, but it also raised difficult questions about how she understood her own actions during that period. Investigators and observers continued examining whether she had fully recognized the harm caused inside the home. Jodi Hildebrandt later entered a plea agreement as well. Prosecutors stated that resolving the case through pleas helped reduce the likelihood that the younger children would need to testify in open court about their experiences there. As prosecutors continued building the case, investigators organized the evidence into several distinct layers. The first involved the medical condition of the two children. Hospital staff documented severe malnourishment, visible wounds, signs of prolonged restraint, and symptoms consistent with extended emotional trauma. According to court records, medical findings indicated the injuries were not recent or isolated events, but part of an ongoing pattern. The second layer focused on the scene inside Jodi Hildebrandt's home in Ivins, Utah. Investigators examined the window the 12-year-old boy used to escape, the area where the 10-year-old girl was located, and items believed to have been connected to restriction or confinement. Reports later referenced ropes, restraint materials, and secured spaces inside the residence that drew attention from law enforcement. A third layer came from witness statements and investigative reports. Detectives collected information from the neighbor who called 911, responding officers, medical personnel, family members, and child welfare authorities. Each account helped investigators establish a broader timeline of events. The final layer involved Ruby Franke's own records and earlier online content. Prosecutors reviewed journals, written notes, and public videos that documented patterns of discipline, deprivation, and isolation over time. Together, the medical evidence, physical scene, witness testimony, and personal documentation created a case strong enough for both Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt to eventually enter guilty pleas in court proceedings. On the 6th of September, 2023, Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt were formally charged and prosecuted at the 5th District Court in St. George, Utah, United States. Both women were officially charged with 6 counts each of aggravated child abuse. In December 2023, Ruby Franke agreed to a plea deal and admitted guilt to 4 felony child abuse charges. During the hearing, she expressed regret and apologized to her children and family members. Even so, public reaction remained deeply divided, with many people focusing on the severity of the children's condition when they were discovered. Jodi Hildebrandt later entered guilty pleas to 4 charges as well. By that point, the legal process had shifted away from determining whether abuse had occurred and toward sentencing and accountability. During the sentencing hearing in February 2024, Ruby addressed the court again. She stated that she had followed harmful beliefs and had been led into an increasingly dangerous mindset. Still, prosecutors emphasized one central fact throughout the proceedings. She had been the children's mother and legal guardian throughout the entire period described in court. On the 20th of February 2024, Ruby Franke was sentenced to 4 consecutive prison terms, each carrying a range of 1 to 15 years under Utah law. Jodi Hildebrandt received the same sentence structure for her role in the case. The sentencing followed guilty pleas entered by both women after months of investigation, medical evaluations, and court proceedings. Some media reports describe the combined sentence as potentially reaching 60 years if each term were added together at the maximum range. However, in Utah, the actual amount of time served is determined by the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. Legal analysts noted that sentencing in Utah does not always function as a simple mathematical total, and parole decisions can significantly affect the final length of incarceration. By the time sentencing concluded, the public image surrounding both women had changed completely. Ruby Franke, once known nationwide as a family YouTube creator who shared parenting advice with millions of viewers, had become a convicted child abuser in the eyes of the court. Jodi Hildebrandt, previously recognized as a counselor and motivational figure through Connections, was also formally convicted for her involvement in the abuse and mistreatment of the children described throughout the investigation and legal proceedings. Freedom was the first thing both women lost after sentencing. Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt now face years inside Utah's prison system for the crimes described throughout the investigation, but the consequences extended far beyond incarceration. Their reputations, careers, and public identities collapsed under the weight of the case. For years, Ruby had built an online brand around the image of a disciplined and organized mother raising 6 children. Millions of viewers followed her parenting advice and family routines. After the arrests and court proceedings, however, her name became associated with one of the most widely discussed child abuse cases of the social media era in the United States. Jodi Hildebrandt experienced a similar fall. Once known as a counselor and motivational figure through Connections, she later came to be viewed by many people as someone who used emotional influence and authority to control vulnerable individuals around her for years. Jodi Hildebrandt experienced a similar fall. Once known as a counselor and motivational figure through Connections, she later came to be viewed by many people as someone who used emotional influence and authority to control vulnerable individuals around her for years. The deepest loss in the case belonged to the children. Beyond the physical suffering documented by investigators, both children were left carrying emotional consequences that could remain with them for years. According to court records and public statements, the damage extended beyond injuries and deprivation. It involved fear, isolation, confusion, and the loss of trust inside their own family. Investigators and mental health experts often note that harm involving a parent can leave, especially lasting psychological effects. In this case, the children were placed in situations where discipline and care became difficult to separate from fear and punishment. That emotional conflict became part of the lasting trauma described throughout the proceedings. The Franke family itself was also permanently changed. Relationships inside the family fractured under public scrutiny, criminal charges, and years of unresolved concern. Relatives later acknowledged that warning signs had existed long before the arrests on the 30th of August, 2023. For many involved, the impact of the case did not end with sentencing. The consequences were expected to continue long after the courtroom proceedings had closed completely. The Ruby Franke case became a powerful reminder that public images on social media do not always reflect reality inside a home. A family may appear stable, organized, and successful on camera while serious control, fear, and emotional harm exist behind closed doors. Investigators and observers later pointed to this contrast as one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The case also demonstrated how discipline can become dangerous when it is pushed to an extreme. When pain, isolation, or deprivation are framed as necessary tools for correcting children, harmful behavior can gradually become normalized inside a family environment. Over time, actions that would once have seemed unacceptable may begin to appear justified to the adults involved. Perhaps the clearest lesson from the investigation is that children do not need absolute control in order to grow into responsible people. They need safety, stability, guidance, and emotional support from the adults around them. The warning signs in this case did not appear all at once. Many were visible much earlier through patterns of punishment, isolation, and language presented publicly as strict parenting over a long period of time before authorities intervened.